In this video today, I'm going to discuss a very interesting topic. Why aren't Gretsch guitars used more often in blues music? And you know, it's always seemed weird to me because Gretsch guitars is a top industry leader with a rich history. From their iconic designs, quality craftsmanship, and technical innovations, it would seem like a natural no-brainer that blues guitarists would want to play them. So in this video, I hope to get to the bottom of why, or at least get a better understanding of why blues guitarists tend to shy away from the brand. This is going to be a really fun deep dive, and I can't wait to get into it. Now, Gretsch guitars can certainly play the blues. Now, personally, I feel like they're underappreciated in the genre. Now, I know they have a unique and different sound to them, especially if you compare them to Fender or Gibson, but that's what makes Gretsch guitars so special. And I hope by the end of this video, we can get rid of any misconceptions non-Gretsch players have about the brand. And I also hope that this video will show players that Gretsch guitars is much more than a guitar that's just suited for rockabilly. Now, many blues guitar icons seem to prefer Fender and Gibsons. Famous blues artists like T-Bone Walker, B.B. King, Freddie King, Albert King, and many others played Gibsons. And other famous blues artists such as Pee Wee Crayton, Albert Collins, Buddy Guy, Stevie Ray Vaughan, Robert Cray, and Ike Turner all preferred Fenders. And of course, who could forget Jimi Hendrix playing his white Strat? And although I'd consider him psychedelic rock, his music was very blues-based, and at times just straight-up blues. And then we've got blues icons like Peter Green, Joe Bonamassa, who played both Fender and Gibsons. And although Eric Clapton used a 6120 with the Yardbirds, he moved on to Gibson and then started favoring Strats. And also Mike Bloomfield started out on the scene playing a Telecaster, then moved on to favor Gibsons. And I could just keep on going with examples. But think of all those famous blues players that I just mentioned. They all play Fender and Gibsons. So one could only imagine that bedroom players and weekend warriors would like to play the same guitars that their heroes are playing. And I'm sure we've all felt like that at some point. And I can remember wanting a Gretsch guitar when I was 12 years old, simply because Mike Nesmith, Brian Setzer, and George Harrison played one. And in my teenage metal years, I wanted a BC Rich because a lot of artists that I liked played them. And you know, I've never played a BC Rich, but I just knew that I wanted one. And that's simply because my guitar heroes played one. So that's just one aspect of why I think blues guitar players associate Fender and Gibson, especially baby boomers, Gen Xers, and millennials, because those popular artists played them. That makes sense, right? But the question is, why did those artists choose to play those guitars? Is it because Gretsch guitars just don't have the universal appeal that Strats, Tellys, Les Pauls, and ES335s have? Or is it because blues guitarists were intimidated by all the switches and knobs on the Gretsch guitars? Was that a turnoff? I don't think so. I don't think the answer could be as simple as that. There's gotta be much more to the story. Besides, do people really think that Gretsches aren't appealing? Because I think they're great. This is a beautiful guitar right here. But that's just my opinion. Now, in the 1940s and especially in the 1950s, blues music was at a pivotal time. It was really making an impact on America. Blues was changing And that's all due to the electric guitar. And in the 1950s, Fender, Gibson, and Gretsch are making some incredible game-changing guitars. And those guitars would become staples in the industry. In fact, the 1950s was the golden age for Gretsch guitars. During that decade, they introduced the renowned 6120, the Duo Jet, and the White Falcon. But blues artists didn't really seem to gravitate to them. Now, one could argue that the bluesmen of that era didn't have a lot of money, especially ones just starting out. And they probably bought guitars they could afford, which is why you see a lot of blues guitar players from back then playing harmonies and other catalog guitars, because they were priced at a much more friendlier budget. Now, a player might have chosen to play Fender back in the 50s because they were the new hip thing with an innovative look, and their guitars certainly sounded unique. But also, players might have chosen to play a Telecaster or Stratocaster over a Gretsch guitar because they were a bit cheaper. And they were much easier guitars to travel with and lug around and more compact, especially if you're playing in a small club rather than playing one of these big old arch tops. And since we're talking about prices, back in 1955, a Gretsch 6120 Chet Atkins model debuted at a price of $385. That's roughly $4,550 in today's money. That's not a budget-friendly guitar by any means. Now, just a year before that, the Stratocaster debuted at a price of $249 with vibrato and $229 without vibrato. And the Telecaster was selling for $189. Now, that same year, a Gibson Les Paul could be purchased for roughly $230. And in 1958, when the Gibson ES335 came out, it bore a price of $267. And although one could say that Gretsch was a bit more expensive than Fender and Gibson back then, they did, however, offer some affordable guitars that were very comparable to Fender and Gibson prices. In fact, when the Gretsch Duo Jet came out, which was Gretsch's answer to the Gibson Les Paul, it had a price tag of $230, which was roughly the same price as a Gibson Les Paul. And in 1958, Gretsch introduced the Anniversary and Double Anniversary models, which was a budget-friendly hollow-bodied guitar. It received the same body shape and construction as the Chet Atkins 6120 model, but it didn't have fingerboard and F-hole binding, and it came as a hardtail only with a G trapeze tailpiece and with no Bigsby option. Now, the Anniversary single pickup version would list for $225, and the two pickup version would list for $310. And that's a very nice price, considering that the 6120s in '58 were now costing $475. And in 1958, Gretsch also introduced the Clipper, which was another budget-friendly hollow body guitar. And in the 1960s, Gretsch sold a lot of those guitars. So there were definitely options from Gretsch that a blues guitar player could choose from. But maybe blues guitar players didn't like the pickups. Gretsch guitars in the 1950s came with DeArmond Dynasonic single coil pickups in the early half of the decade, and they're known for their bright and clear tone. Now, in 1957, Gretsch introduced the Filtertron humbucking pickup, which has a bright, clear, and articulate sound with a strong mid-range presence. And although those pickups are different from the sounds of PAFs and P90s, but I think all of those pickups sound great. The PAFs, the P90s, the Filtertrons, the Dynasonics, great pickups for sure. So let's talk availability and distribution. Were Gretsch guitars readily available in small-town music stores and in the small cities throughout the US? And were Fender and Gibsons available in more places? That could be a small part of the equation depending on where you lived. And that could be maybe why certain players didn't buy a Gretsch because they couldn't get their hands on one. I can remember growing up in the 80s, I had two local music shops in my town. And those two stores carried off-brand guitars like Hondo, Aria, Vantage, Court. But luckily for me, there was a Sam Ash huge box guitar store 35 minutes away. And they carried, of course, a slew of brands. But that's just something to think about. Was it an availability issue? Now I've saved one of my biggest points for last. Back in the 50s, I feel as if many blues guitarists associated the Gretsch brand with country music. And in that decade, Gretsch came out with the Country Club, which was a guitar that was made to compete with the Gibson L5 CES. But the name of that guitar was obviously geared towards country music musicians. Then there was the Gretsch 6120 Chet Atkins model. And that started Gretsch on a very long-standing relationship with one of country music's finest guitar players. In fact, that endorsement deal lasted 25 years. And they even made a solid body version of the 6120, and that was called the 6121. And in 1957, Gretsch came out with the Chet Atkins Country Gentleman, which George Harrison was particularly fond of, and you can see him playing one on the Beatles' performance on the Ed Sullivan Show. And then in 1958, Gretsch introduced the Chet Atkins Tennessean. So you've got a bunch of guitars now with a countryish name to them, and a few of them were even associated with a renowned Nashville A-Team country guitar player, and it probably did seem that Gretsch was trying to associate themselves with country. And when the Chet Atkins 6120 and 6121s first came out, they had Western-style appointments on them. They came with a steerhead headstock inlay, prickly cactuses on the fingerboard, and a large G was branded into the guitar, just like you would see on a cattle. But by 1956, I believe, the steerhead and cactuses were dropped. Chet Atkins wasn't really a big fan of that, and they replaced the steerhead on the headstock with a horseshoe. And I believe by 1957, we would finally see the disappearance of the G brand on the guitar. But here's the point I'm trying to make here. Let's say you're a blues guitar player and you live in the big city of Chicago. And you're ready to play your gig tonight at a swanky, smoky juke joint. Would you really want to go on stage with an orange guitar with Western-style appointments all over it? Or play a signature model guitar by the Country Gentleman? Heck no! You're not playing at the Grand Ole Opry. You're not going on the Louisiana Hayride to perform. You're playing at a dirty, smoky, swanky juke joint, playing some blues. So why would you want to play a guitar that's associated with country music, right? That could be the thought process of many blues musicians back in the day. Now, for the past 44 years or so, Gretsch has kind of been pigeonholed as solely a rockabilly guitar. And of course, not everybody thinks that, but a good majority. And I think that's all due to Brian Setzer. He's literally been waving the Gretsch flag forever. And the brand has completely embraced him, and they've made a few signature models. And it's safe to say that Brian Setzer clearly put Gretsch guitars back on the map. And Brian's responsible for a lot of aspiring rockabilly guitar players wanting a Gretsch guitar. Now, back in the early 80s, when the Stray Cats were making headlines, there was also a psychobilly group called the Cramps, who were also making a name for themselves. And that group featured Poison Ivy on guitar, playing a Gretsch 6120. And for the past 30-ish years or so, guitarist Jim Heath from the Reverend Horton Heat has been waving the Gretsch flag as well. In fact, Gretsch has produced a signature model guitar for him. Now, of course, Gretsch was around back in the 50s when rockabilly was big and rock and roll was now taking off. but they weren't considered the holy grail of rockabilly guitars back then. But yes, of course, we had Eddie Cochran playing a 6120, Cliff Gallup playing a Duo Jet, Buddy Knox played a Gretsch guitar, and even James Burton played a Gretsch early on. And in case you didn't know, Chet Atkins played on a lot of rockabilly tunes. But Fender and Gibsons were probably played more by guitarists back in that genre. But even though many players think Gretsch guitars are just for rockabilly, I think a lot of guitar players are coming around and realizing that Gretsch guitars can do so much more. And if you think about it, Gretsch has been around, maybe not in the super forefront, but many players throughout the years have gravitated toward them. Think of Mike Campbell, Pete Townsend, Billy Duffy, Malcolm Young, George Harrison, Billy Zoom, Neil Young, and Stephen Stills all played Gretsch nowadays or at one time. And nowadays, a lot of worship guitar players are into Gretsch. And you know, Gretsch really does have a wide appeal. Punk rock icon Tim Armstrong has a signature model. And that's just awesome because, you know, Gretsch guitars really can do it all. And now, very quickly, I'd just like to acknowledge the blues guitarists that do play Gretsch, because there's a few, and I think it's very important to talk about them. So first, I gotta mention Bo Diddley. That man played his Gretsch guitars all the way into the Blues Hall of Fame. And although he's mostly associated as a rock and roll pioneer, his music has always had deep bluesy roots. Also, I've got to mention guitarist Calvin Newborn. He was known to play Gretsch back in the day, and he's played on some really killer jump blues tracks back then. And you can hear him play some amazing solos on some of B.B. King's early jump blues tracks. Now, another guitarist that I'd like to mention is Robert Lockwood Jr. He's played with Little Walter, and he's been associated with many different blues acts. And he played a Gretsch Country Gentleman in the 60s, and he was known to play it for many years. And here's a little fun fact. He was taught guitar by Robert Johnson. Also, I wanted to mention Robert Nighthawk. He's been known to play a Gretsch Corvette. And finally, I'd like to mention a favorite of mine, a West Coast blues icon, Lowell Fulson. He owned a 60s stereo White Falcon, and he was known to play it in his later years of his career. In fact, if you want to see him playing his White Falcon, there's a great clip of him in the 80s on YouTube playing his song Reconsider Baby. It's a great performance and the guitar sounds great. Well friends, I'm going to wrap things up here, and I just want to thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope it gave you some food for thought on this topic. And you know, maybe we'll never really know why Gretsch guitars aren't used that much in blues, but we can certainly hope that things do change, and I think that they are. And if there's anything else that you'd like to add about this discussion, please leave a comment so myself and others can read it. Also, let me know if you're a blues player that loves playing Gretsch guitars. Now, obviously, I'm a big fan of Gretsch guitars, but I'm not one of those Gretsch is the only guitar for me type of guy. I like a lot of different brands. But I gotta just say this, if there's a certain type of music that you want to play, well, a Gretsch guitar can certainly get it done for you. And now friends, I'd like to leave you with some inspiring words. And today I'd like to share with you this quote from Vince Lombardi. Perfection is not obtainable, but if we chase perfection, we can catch excellence. And with that friends, I'm gonna say goodbye to you. Much love to you all, stay safe, and I'll see you soon in another guitar video. Take care everybody, and bye-bye.